So moving on with that, we go to another story which also comes from Bleeping Computer, and the title here, if I can get to it, is "Recent GitHub supply chain attack traced to leak spot bugs token." So we talked to, I think it was last week or the week before, about the TJ Actions changed files of exploit vulnerability attack, however you want to describe it, that was weaponized to steal credentials out of repositories. There were something like 12,000 repositories that used this particular action. It successfully captured credentials out of a little over 200 repositories. There's some confusion in various media reports I've seen about whether or not any actual credentials were ultimately stolen. This article here seems to imply that there were, but that's not really the point of the article here. The this walks through the chain of events that led to this particular attack, and it's quite convoluted. So, and I'll say at the start that the apparent target of the attack was Coinbase, which actually doesn't surprise me because a lot of these attacks, like the NPM attacks and whatnot, are very often, very, very frequently intended to go after crypto key or cryptocurrency wallets. And so this is another example of a threat actor trying to get at some cryptocurrency. But this one demonstrates a level of sophistication I think we haven't really seen in this kind of attack up to now. So the attack started a while ago. I think it was back in November when there's a static code analysis tool called Spotbugs was breached. And that was breached when one of their contributors apparently accidentally included a GitHub personal access token in a code commit. And that in turn led to the threat actor compromising another action, which resulted in stealing a personal access token from contributor to ReviewDog, which is another, I think it's another code review tool. And that contributor to ReviewDog was also a contributor on the TJ Actions changed files action, which allowed the threat actor to then do a couple of fairly novel things, in my estimation, on that TJ Actions changed files. That's very clearly what they were ultimately trying to get to. What they did was they effectively hijacked that action by changing some tags on pull requests so that when victims who used this action ran that request, it was basically pulling code. It was executing code that was contributed by the bad actor. That code, in turn, was intended to pull out credentials from code and store them in a place that the actor could get to. Now, Coinbase, for their part, says that they weren't actually successful in running this on Coinbase's repository. So they were a number of people, like 218, I think is the number of repositories that had credentials pulled out. Again, don't know if they were actually exfiltrated, but Coinbase was not one of them. So,
well, the way I
interesting.
read this is slightly different, is that
Okay.
Coinbase was impacted by this, but the way that the secrets are committed to log, it's only really a problem if that repository is public. So if your repository is private and you run this, the secret is printed out to workflow log, which is interesting to me that there wasn't another step with all this effort that went into this. And what seemingly to me is a very clever and smart effort, but I don't know a lot about this world. When they dumped the secret from memory, they just dumped it as a log entry in the GitHub workflow. So any public repo, that workflow logging is public. So those 218 repositories are the ones that had this happen, and they were public. But as I understand it, if you're private and this happened to you, that log entry went to a private repo that only your own people could see.
Okay. I misread that then. Okay, that makes sense. So they did actually, they were impacted by the malicious action, but because of how they had their security set up, the security on the repo set up, the
It
credentials
didn't
weren't
leak. Yeah.
accessible. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Well, it
That
didn't
makes
leak
sense.
to the outside. I mean, it depends on whether or not you define a secret being dumped to your log file. A leak internally is a different conversation. Yes.
Interesting. So this is obviously a financially motivated attack, right? Now, that's not to
Well,
say we well, go ahead. Go
it's
ahead.
kind of like the modern day version of why do you rob banks?
True.
Because that's where
True.
the money is. Why do you go target, crypto companies? Because that's where the cryptocurrency is.
Well, what else? I was trying to draw the distinction between, this was on its face, a fairly sophisticated attack. Had a had a plan, and that plan had multiple steps. Now, I don't know exactly how coincidental, like, it's a little unclear to me how much of this plan was laid out ahead of time versus just kind of fortuitous events as they went along.
Yeah, did they know that Coinbase used TJ Actions changed files, or was that fortunate happenstance? I don't know.
Yeah, so I would assume that they somehow knew. I mean, that's kind of the implication that you get from this article and several others that I've read on the topic. So anyway, point is, not all threat actors are necessarily state sponsored, although we do know that some nation state actors are financially motivated. Like there's a lot of discussion about how North Korea is big into stealing cryptocurrency. So we know it happens, but I think the challenge is that a lot of threat actors, the more commodity threat actors, pay attention to the tactics that the more advanced ones are using and modeling their attacks after those. And so
Sure.
what was in the past, the realm of like Uber APT, you had to be some really high profile target. Now it's not so much the case anymore. Now, I think Coinbase is a pretty high profile target. Like if you can get into that, I'm sure there's lots of opportunity to steal significant money.
So they do have one recommendation here, and there was a lot more that we talked on the previous side, but in GitHub you have this option of pinning dependencies using commit hashes instead of tags. So in this case, the tag didn't increment. It was still like the V1 tag. And in theory, you're supposed to increment when you change something, V1, V2, V3. But the hash would have changed because the code was different. So one thing GitHub recommends is, hey, look at your dependencies and look at these, commit their hashes and validate the hashes. I mean, you could still be tricked by not knowing, like if you update a hash to an updated malicious supply chain attack in your dependency code, that's not perfect. Like I still think we've got this gap here of we just import these dependencies and there's a huge amount of trust that we're putting in them without a whole lot of vetting right now in general. Like this feels like a big open attack surface that we're not doing a very good job at of mitigating the risk for software houses.
Yeah, definitely. And these actions are I think a special class of vulnerability that we're only really starting to explore. Ultimately, they're effectively third-party code that you're running on your code base at different trigger points. So,
That's being live updated
right,
potentially. Yeah.
correct.
So yeah, that's fun.
But before we started recording, we were talking about how this is becoming its own branch of IT. And I was kind of joking when I said it, but I actually think that it may ultimately be the case. We need something like a chief development officer who deeply understands how to structure code repositories, is responsible for, the ecosystem of stuff that happens within it. I think it's gotten more complex than than we're really giving it credit for. And it's certainly more complex than just like treating it as another application, like
Mm-hmm.
email or something like that. It is becoming very high risk. It has sensitive information, and the supply. I think the supply chain type attack situation is growing to a point of, it's becoming so acute that I think we're going to have to take, as an industry, more drastic actions to get it under control. Uh, Now I know I'm not stupid. We're not going to.
I've never used it, but like one option I know about there is like Google offers a curated dependency library that you could pull from as one option. I've never experimented with it. I don't know if it's any good. I'm not endorsing it, but like that is one potential approach. Now, I have no idea how good their security would be around something like this. The other thing that occurs to me is how complicated this is
Yes.
and how many nuances and little tiny changes that can have a big impact in security that are not well understood by, I think, most security folks, unless they're deep into the developer workflow and understand and have worked with this. And I'm not saying all security people need to go be coders or they suck, which is what some people see out there. I disagree with that statement. But not understanding the exact nuance of this application and how code moves through this application and permissions and the interactions and the ecosystem around it is common. And I think that makes it harder to secure it well if you don't fully understand it. And the reality is, if you had a chief development officer, is great, but if their goal is efficiency and speed and clean code, they may not look at necessarily from the security side. So it's almost like a chief development security officer. Like you need that dual hat, I think, to get what I think you want out of that role.
So I think the other thing that is weighing on this is kind of the history of IT. In times gone by, we applied our effort in our protection on production stuff. Development and labs and whatnot tended to be internal resources. And the reality is the world has moved on. A lot of this stuff happens either directly connected to or adjacent to the internet. As we talked about, we're trusting third party code that hasn't necessarily been vetted by us. And the systems that we store and manage and process our code in have gotten much more complex as well. But I still think that we're treating it like it's not production, like it's just the development environment. It's just the source code. And I think too many companies still have this notion of, well, it's not like credit card numbers. Like if I lose my
Right.
source code, that's bad. It's proprietary code. They're not. They're I think thinking about the peril as my code gets disclosed. And while bad, a lot of companies would say, well, like I'm willing to allow my code to be disclosed in order to save $10 million of like security stuff, or having to hire more developers because we have to be less efficient, or what have you. But the challenge is, like, that's not the only peril anymore. The big peril now is that your code is somehow weaponized to attack your customers, or one of your customers, or something like that.
And unlike Quest for Holy Grail, that is not the peril you want to face.
Very true.
For you young people, go ask your parents.
It's definitely worth the question.